Dramatic music fades in. Imagine waking up one day to find that the island you live on has just become the most valuable piece of real estate on the planet. Not because of gold or oil, but because the entire future of technology, and therefore the world, depends on its factories, its engineers, and its chips. This isn't a hypothetical scenario. This is what happened to Taiwan in the 1990s. And by the time you finish this story, you'll understand why this island of 23 million people now controls the lifeblood of the modern economy. Because if Taiwan's factories stop running, the global supply chain collapses. Music shifts to tense, anticipatory tone. Taiwan wasn't always the center of the world's attention. In fact, just 50 years ago, it was a poor, agrarian society, still recovering from civil war. Its GDP per capita was lower than that of Yemen. Its economy was so weak that in the 1950s, the government had to import rice to feed its people. But today, Taiwan is the world's 21st largest economy. It produces 60% of the world's semiconductors. And when you use your phone, laptop, or car, there's a 90% chance a Taiwanese chip made its way into it. So how did a tiny island, smaller than Belgium, go from famine to semiconductor superpower in a single generation? And more importantly, what would happen if it disappeared tomorrow? Music cuts abruptly. This is the story of how Taiwan built an empire not with swords or soldiers, but with silicon, strategy, and sheer stubbornness. It's a story of geopolitical chess, of economic warfare, and of a nation that refused to be forgotten. Music swells again. To understand why Taiwan is so important, we need to go back to the 1950s. After World War II, China was torn apart by civil war. The losing side, the Kuomintang, or KMT, fled to Taiwan with their leader Chiang Kai-shek. For decades, the KMT ruled Taiwan as a dictatorship, crushing dissent and claiming it was the legitimate government of all China. The US backed them during the Cold War, pouring billions into the island to keep it as a bulwark against communism. But Taiwan was not just a pawn in the Cold War, it was a blank canvas. And in the 1960s, a group of visionary leaders saw an opportunity: electronics. At the time, Japan was the dominant player in consumer electronics. Sony, Panasonic, and Sharp were household names. But Taiwan? It was still making shoes, textiles, and cheap toys. That changed in 1964. A young engineer named Morris Chang returned to Taiwan after decades working in the US semiconductor industry. He had a radical idea: what if Taiwan didn't just assemble electronics, but designed and manufactured the most critical component of all? The chip. Chang pitched the government on building a semiconductor industry from scratch. They listened. And in 1974, the government granted him $100 million to create the first semiconductor company in Taiwan. It was called the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, or TSMC. Now, here's where most people get the story wrong. Most assume that TSMC became successful because Taiwan had cheap labor, or because the government gave it subsidies. But the real secret was something far more powerful: a business model so innovative that it changed the entire industry. Instead of competing with giants like Intel or Samsung by making their own chips, TSMC became the world's first dedicated semiconductor foundry, a factory that manufactures chips for other companies. This was unheard of at the time. In the 1980s, every major tech company, IBM, Motorola, Philips, designed and built their own chips in-house. But Morris Chang flipped the script. He told those companies, "You design the chip. We'll build it. And you'll pay us for every wafer we produce." It was like offering a tailor-made suit factory to clothing brands. Why sew your own clothes when you can outsource the work to specialists? At first, the idea was met with skepticism. But Chang had a secret weapon: patience. He spent years convincing skeptical clients, refining processes, and building trust. By the late 1990s, TSMC was the world's second-largest semiconductor manufacturer. And then, disaster struck. In 2000, the dot-com bubble burst. Tech stocks crashed. Companies slashed R&D budgets. TSMC's cash flow dried up. Its stock price plummeted. Analysts predicted its collapse. But Morris Chang didn't panic. Instead, he made a bold bet: he would double down on innovation. While competitors cut costs, TSMC invested $4 billion in new manufacturing plants. While others abandoned risky research, TSMC poured money into developing smaller, more powerful chips, what we now call the nanometer process. And then, in 2007, the iPhone exploded onto the scene. Suddenly, every smartphone, tablet, and laptop needed chips that were smaller, faster, and more efficient. And TSMC was the only company in the world capable of producing them at scale. By 2010, TSMC was the most valuable company in Taiwan. By 2015, it was a global leader. And by 2020, it was worth more than Intel, Samsung, and every other chipmaker combined. Today, TSMC is valued at over $500 billion. It produces 90% of the world's most advanced chips. And its customers include Apple, Nvidia, AMD, and Tesla. But TSMC's rise wasn't just about making money. It was about survival. Music shifts to tense, urgent tone, because Taiwan's semiconductor empire wasn't built in a vacuum. It was forged in the fires of geopolitical struggle. In the 1990s, China began asserting its claim to Taiwan. In 2005, it passed the anti-secession law, declaring that it would use non-peaceful means to prevent Taiwanese independence. Then, in 2018, the trade war between the US and China began. And suddenly, semiconductors weren't just a business, they were a weapon. China, desperate to reduce its dependence on foreign chips, launched a $150 billion plan to build its own semiconductor industry. But progress was slow. Today, China still lags 5 to 10 years behind TSMC in advanced chip production. Meanwhile, the US, realizing its own vulnerability, passed the CHIPS Act in 2022, a $52 billion subsidy package to boost domestic chip manufacturing. But here's the catch: even with unlimited funding, neither the US nor China can replicate TSMC's ecosystem overnight. Because TSMC's real empire isn't just its factories, it's its supply chain. Its engineers. Its culture of innovation. And that's something no government can build with money alone. Music shifts to reflective, contemplative tone, so what are the lessons of Taiwan's rise? What can we learn from its empire? First, focus on what you do best, and outsource the rest. TSMC didn't try to compete with Apple or Nvidia. It became the world's best chipmaker by specializing in manufacturing. Second, innovation isn't a sprint, it's a marathon. Morris Chang spent decades preparing TSMC for the moment when the world would need advanced chips. And when that moment came, TSMC was ready. Third, economic power is the ultimate form of soft power. Taiwan didn't need an army to become indispensable. It built an empire by making itself too valuable to ignore. Music shifts to hopeful, forward-looking tone. Today, Taiwan faces enormous challenges. China's military threats loom large. Global supply chains are strained. And the semiconductor industry is on the cusp of another revolution, with quantum computing and AI chips on the horizon. But if history is any indication, Taiwan will adapt. It always has. Because that's what empires do. They rise. They fall. And when they fall, they rise again, stronger than before. Music fades out. This story isn't just about Taiwan. It's about how ideas, strategy, and stubbornness can turn a tiny island into the center of the world. And the next time you use your phone or drive your car, remember, somewhere in Taiwan, a machine is working overtime to make it possible. Music ends. Like and subscribe to Empire Explained for more stories on history's greatest empires.